Thank you for having me speak at this conference. It's really a pleasure to be invited. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I have three small children aged 3 and under, so international travel is a little bit difficult right now. And what I want to do in the remarks that I've prepared for today is talk about John Paul II's natural law legacy, international human rights, the theme of the conference, as applied to the abortion debate. And in particular, as he presents some of those thoughts in his encyclical letter, Evangelium Vitae. I think this is particularly timely in the American context, given the leaked opinion in the Dobbs case, Justice Samuel Alito's majority opinion there that would overturn Roe and Casey and return abortion to the democratic processes. But it's relevant all across Western Europe and really all across the globe. And my remarks today come in 3 parts. I want to say a little bit about the morality of abortion and how John Paul presents the morality of abortion and how that intersects with some of the debates that we frequently hear today. I want to say, second, a little bit about democracy and the role of morality and human rights as applied to the abortion debate and the critique that John Paul makes of mistaken notions of democracy and how they apply to abortion. And then lastly, I want to say a little bit about God and about religion and about how religion is both central to the gospel of life. Obviously, God is central, but also how John Paul thinks natural law plays into this. And I'll be peppering the entire remarks with some of those natural law thoughts from John Paul. All right, so the first thing about the morality of abortion. What John Paul points out is common to the entire kind of international human rights project is that there's something unique about the human animal, the human person, and that the human person is unique amongst creation, and that this is what is the foundation of any sound human rights project. So in paragraph 19 of Evangelium Vitae, John Paul writes, "The theory of human rights is based precisely on the affirmation that the human person, unlike animals and things, cannot be subjected to domination by others." And then he immediately goes on to point out that there are a variety of people who make a variety of, to my mind, bad, not only unpersuasive, but just just weak arguments to try to explain away the personhood of the unborn. They'll also make bad arguments about freedom, what Servas Pinkers refers to as freedom of indifference rather than freedom for excellence, freedom not ordered towards objective good, freedom not in solidarity with the weak, the poor, the marginalized. And John Paul addresses those, but I want to focus right now more on those who seek to explain away either the humanity or the personhood of the unborn. Because we've been hearing that for the past few weeks, but really for the past few decades, that it's just a clump of cell, that we don't know when life begins, that when life begins is not just a scientific question, it's a metaphysical question, it's a religious question, and there's no answer there. In paragraph 60 of Evangelium Vitae, John Paul goes through modern embryology, the modern science of what we can know about when the life of an individual human being begins. The science really isn't all that unclear right now. Many of us have ultrasound pictures in baby books, either of ourselves or of our children, that highlight that life in the womb. People who argue it's just a clump of cells, people who argue that we don't know when life begins, unless they're talking about, at what exact moment when the sperm penetrates the ovum, at what exact moment is it syngamy when the two pronuclei line up, et cetera, et cetera. That might be a debate worth having, although I actually think we have pretty good scientific evidence there as well. But if they're saying that, by the time you're pregnant, you still don't know when the life of a human being has begun, I think those arguments are largely built on straw, and they're meant to be distractions. The more rigorous debates are the various personhood debates. And this is where you'll hear honest bioethicists say, of course, it's a human being, but it's not yet a human person. And they appeal to a variety of personal attributes that they claim people have: self-consciousness, the ability for immediately exercisable rational thought, self-awareness, et cetera, et cetera. And they say these things don't develop, and human beings don't have the immediate exercisable capacity for them until sometime later in life. And so the unborn child, like the newborn child, is a human being, but not yet a human person. John Paul responds in that same paragraph 60 of Evangelium Vitae, by citing a CDF document, Donum Vitae. And the very last line of that citation, he says, how could a human individual not be a human person? And what he's appealing to here is that if we take the Boethius definition of person being a singular substance of a rational nature, how could a human individual, a human being, not be a singular substance of a rational nature? That we know something about human nature. We know something about the type of creature the human fetus is, that it has the very same nature as the human adult. Right? There's no substantial change that takes place. Embryo, fetus, newborn, toddler, young adult, middle-aged man, et cetera, those aren't different substances. It's the same substance at different stages of development, at different ages, and they're all rational animals, which makes them all persons. Now, all of these arguments are philosophical in nature. The arguments about personhood, they all are, first, the scientific arguments about when human life begins, when the life of a new human being begins, scientific arguments about what's the substance growing in the womb, and then moral arguments, metaphysical arguments about, is it a person? Does it have moral status? Does it have human dignity? Those are all taking place at the level of reason. They don't require revelation. Good biology, sound philosophy will get you at those correct answers. They're part of the natural law, not just the supernatural law. And so it's, I think it's telling that where John Paul invokes kind of the full teaching authority of the papal magisterium to teach that the direct killing of innocent human beings is always gravely wrong. This is what he writes. He says, therefore, by the authority with Christ conferred upon Peter and his successors, and in communion with the bishops of the Catholic Church, I confirm that the direct and voluntary killing of an innocent human being is always gravely immoral. This doctrine, based upon that unwritten law which man, in the light of reason, finds in his own heart, is reaffirmed by sacred scripture, transmitted by the tradition of the Church, and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Several paragraphs later, when he then applies that teaching to the issue of abortion, he then follows by saying, this doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God. And then it's transmitted by the Church's authority, taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. The reason I want to highlight that is that in the previous condemnation that I read, he says this doctrine, it's based upon the unwritten law, which man in the light of reason finds in his own heart. And then he says it's reaffirmed by sacred scripture. That for John Paul, these are creational truths. These are truths that are based upon God's creation of the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, destined for unity with God. And so they're written on their heart. They're part of the natural law. And then revelation confirms them. The teaching of the Church confirms them. But neither revelation nor the teaching of the Church adds new content. It doesn't change the content. It doesn't add new content, with this respect, right? In respect of the direct and intentional killing of innocent human life being always wrong. All right, so that's all I wanted to say for the first part. Now I want to say a little bit about democracy and the role of morality and human rights thinking as applied to the abortion debate. Because I actually think Evangelium Vitae is just a stunning, profound critique of various aspects of modernity, especially liberal modernity. And there's an excellent book written by a friend of mine, Carson Holloway, a political theorist at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, published maybe 20 years ago now, titled The Way of Life, John Paul II and the Challenge of Liberal Modernity. And what Carson points out in that book, what John Paul is doing in the encyclical, is pointing out how various political movements, political regimes, traditions of rationality, philosophical traditions that tried to elevate human dignity, that first gave us the human rights tradition, now in a kind of tragic way are turning against that. And there are various debates about whether or not this was all kind of baked into the cake, whether this was the inevitable conclusion, whether it's just working out its own internal logic, or if it's betraying that logic. And I think those debates are worth having. Here's what John Paul II writes in paragraph 18. The process which once led to discovering the idea of human rights, rights inherent in every person and prior to any constitution and state legislation, is today marked by a surprising contradiction. Precisely in an age when the inviolable rights of the person are solemnly proclaimed and the value of life is publicly affirmed, the very right to life is being denied or trampled upon, especially at the more significant moments of existence, the moment of birth and the moment of death. And what John Paul goes on to point out is that we've always had sin. We've always had killing. I mean, this goes back to Cain and Abel, and he uses the story of Cain and Abel throughout Evangelium Vitae. But what he points out as new is that we're now claiming a right to sin, a right to kill. That instead of a real, natural, authentic human right, the right to life, we're now having claims that there's a right to abortion, a right to choose, a right to reproductive autonomy, various euphemisms for what really takes place in every abortion, the killing of an unborn child. He points out, I want to read you another paragraph, that this is taking place in a way that is moving us towards a democratic form of totalitarian. He says, the original and inalienable right to life is questioned or denied on the basis of a parliamentary vote or the will of one part of the people, even if it is the majority. This is the sinister result of a relativism which reigns unopposed. The right ceases to be such because it is no longer firmly grounded on the inviolable dignity of the person, but is made subject to the will of the stronger part. In this way, democracy, contradicting its own principles, effectively moves towards a form of totalitarianism. And he spells out how that happens. He says that, this is paragraph 69, in the democratic culture of our time, it's commonly held that the legal system of any society should limit itself to taking account of and accepting the convictions of the majority. So that democracy is just pure procedural majority rule. He moves on saying that, look, there are many democracies that think that objective truth doesn't exist, or that it's unattainable, or that basing laws on objective truth doesn't have enough respect for the citizens. He goes on in the next paragraph saying that there are those, this is a direct quote, there are those who consider such relativism an essential condition of democracy, inasmuch as it alone is held to guarantee tolerance, mutual respect between people, and acceptance of the decisions of the majority, whereas moral norms, considered to be objective and binding, are held to lead to authoritarianism and intolerance. Which John Paul, the overarching critique of Evangelium Vitae is that it's the exact opposite. That if it's just majority rule, if we deny that objective truths exist and are knowable, all we're left with is the shifting sand of the will to power, that right makes right, and that majority opinion has its way irrespective of the truth. And that as a result of that, that threatens to undermine an entire system of human rights. That a system of human rights, a system of authentic democracy, needs to have a firm moral foundation. Otherwise, it can't actually protect the types of freedom and the types of rights that it really ought to be, authentic rights. And he has a retorsive argument here. He says, everyone's conscience rightly rejects those crimes against humanity of which our century has had such sad experience. So think of all the various totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, and he says, everyone's conscience rightly rejects those crimes. Then he adds, but would these crimes cease to be crimes if instead of being committed by unscrupulous tyrants, they were legitimated by popular consensus? He goes on, democracy cannot be idolized to the point of making it a substitute for morality or a panacea for immorality. Fundamentally, democracy is a system, and as such is a means, not an end. Its moral value is not automatic, but depends on conformity to the moral law to which it, like every other form of human behavior, must be subject. In other words, its morality, the morality of democracy, depends on the morality of the ends which it pursues and of the means which it employs. And so one of the things that you frequently hear during the abortion debate is, don't impose your morality on me. Don't legislate morality. Don't, quote, establish religion. And I think the pushback here, and John Paul is making a very essential pushback, is that every law is based on morality. That you can't escape that. And we need every law to be based on a true conception of morality. We need every law to be based on authentic morality, true morality. Every law is going to be based on some moral vision. There's no such thing as kind of a morally neutral piece of legislation. There's no such thing as a piece of legislation that doesn't rest upon and build upon some vision of human nature and human flourishing. The only question is it going to be a true vision of human nature and human flourishing? Our moral views are influenced by our metaphysical views. There's no escaping that as well. That's just inevitable, that our moral views will be influenced by our metaphysical views. Many people's metaphysical views are influenced by their religious views. Again, this inevitably happens. The argument I want to make is that this should happen deliberatively. This should be intentional. We should intentionally have our religious views influence our metaphysical views, influence our legal and political views. The Rawlsian search for, quote, public reasons that are somehow other than or different from just reason well thought through all the way through is a fool's errand. And so what we want to do is have all of our man-made laws reflect the natural law. And there, John Paul cites Thomas Aquinas, and he goes through the various discussion of how we want to have human law reflect the natural law and the divine law. He writes, consequently, there is a need to recover the basic elements of a vision of the relationship between civil law and moral law, which are put forward by the Church, but which are also part of the patrimony of the great juridical traditions of humanity. And then the last thing I want to say in this section about the role of morality and human rights to democracy, and particularly the right to life, John Paul explains that when freedom is detached from objective truth, it becomes impossible to establish personal rights on a firm, rational basis. That's his response, and that's in paragraph 96. That's his response to the relativism argument, that relativism is the best way of protecting coexistence and pluralism and human rights. He wants to respond both to the democracy just is majority rule and the, well, truth claims are really, really scary into democracy by saying no. Public opinion, popular rule needs to be influenced by truth claims. Freedom needs to be attached to objective truth, because otherwise it's going to be impossible to have any firm, rational basis for claims to human rights, claims to personal rights. All right, last thing I want to say is a little bit about God and religion, because I've been emphasizing the natural law foundations, and obviously with the conference being on John Paul's natural law legacy and the International Human Rights Project, it's appropriate to emphasize that. And John Paul himself does that, but he also offers a critique of that. And so I want to highlight both. In the very beginning of Evangelium Vitae, when he's talking about the gospel of life, John Paul writes the following: "This is the gospel which, already present in the revelation of the Old Testament, and indeed written in the heart of every man and woman, has echoed in every conscience from the beginning, from the time of creation itself, in such a way that, despite the negative consequences of sin, it can also be known in its essential traits by human reason." What John Paul is getting at here is a larger conception of human reason, because he's arguing not just that the negative precepts of the Decalogue can be known by human reason, the natural law. He's saying that the gospel of life, right? This is the gospel which is already present in the revelation of the Old Testament. It's fully revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ, but he's saying it's present in the Old Testament, and indeed it's written on the heart of every man, echoed in every conscience from the beginning, from creation itself. And that even with the negative consequences of sin, even with the noetic consequences of sin, how they impact our knowledge, result of the fall, in its essentials, human reason can know this. But then he offers his critique. And so in paragraph 21, he says, in seeking the deepest roots of the struggle between the culture of life and the culture of death, we cannot restrict ourselves to the perverse idea of freedom mentioned above, loosely the freedom of indifference versus freedom for excellence. We have to go to the heart of the tragedy being experienced by modern man, the eclipse of the sense of God and of man, typical of a social and cultural climate dominated by secularism, which, with its ubiquitous tentacles, succeeds at times in putting Christian communities themselves to the test. Those who allow themselves to be influenced by this climate easily fall into a sad, vicious circle. When the sense of God is lost, there's also a tendency to lose the sense of man, of his dignity and his life. In turn, the systematic violation of the moral law, especially in the serious matter of respect for human life and its dignity, produces a kind of progressive darkening of the capacity to discern God's living and saving presence. Consequently, when the sense of God is lost, the sense of man is also threatened and poisoned. As the Second Vatican Council concisely states, without the Creator, the creature would disappear. When God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. What John Paul is highlighting here, what the Second Vatican Council is highlighting, it's building off of some of the arguments Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac and his drama of atheistic humanism, that many of the Enlightenment thinkers, the humanistic thinkers, thought by eclipsing God they would be elevating man, when in reality the loss of the sense of God leads to the loss of man. Without the Creator, the creature would disappear. When God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. And that's part of the critique that John Paul II is making. And to an amazing extent, he's saying that we can know a lot of that by reason, right? This is, you can think about Pope Benedict, the emeritus Pope. He has a book titled A Reason Open to God. It's a collection of the speeches and other addresses he gave in the United States, published by CUA Press. A Reason Open to God. It's a more capacious reason. It's not the narrow scientific Enlightenment rationality vision of reason. That reason can know that God exists. Reason can know to a certain extent that we're made in the image and likeness of God, that we have God-like capacities for reason and will. Reason can know that what our final end is, contemplation of God, at least a certain aspect of our final end. It can't know the fullness about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. That needs to be revealed to us, but it can know something about man's natural final end, if not also some glimmer of the supernatural final end. John Paul lines up the dignity of man in both his origins and his destiny, being made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore being destined for final friendship with God, should he cooperate with grace. Which is simply to say, in our culture, as we've rejected the fullness of reason, as we've rejected revelation, grace that builds on nature, revelation that perfects reason, it's making defending the truth about the dignity of human life, the truth about the right to life, the human right to life, that much more difficult. Which also means that the response is going to need to be both championing the science, natural realities about when life in the womb begins, championing the philosophy, the morality based on human equality, based on every human individual being a human person. But we're also going to need to evangelize. Because ultimately a culture that's not open to God, a reason that's not open to God, but a culture that's not open to God is going to fall prey to perverse forms of freedom, to materialism, to relativism, right? Exactly the things that John Paul diagnoses as what's lying at the foundation of our culture of death. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to present today with you, and I only wish I could have been there in person.